Isolation doesn't usually feel dangerous at first. In fact, it often feels necessary. It feels like space, like breathing room, like protection. After a hard conversation, you pull back. After being misunderstood, you keep things to yourself. After getting hurt, you decide it's just easier to deal with things on your own. And if you're being honest, there's a part of you that likes it. No expectations, no awkward conversations, no risks of being misunderstood again. Just you, managing life on your terms. But here's the problem. What starts as protection slowly becomes a prison. Because isolation doesn't just keep the pain out, it keeps the healing out too. And the longer you stay there, the harder it becomes to see clearly, think clearly, and live freely. Today, we're going to talk about the cost of isolation. Welcome to Unmasked, where we take off the filters and we get real about faith, failure, and finding freedom. I'm your host, Wesley Farnsworth, and this is episode 2 of our mini-series, Breaking Free. In the last episode, we talked about the lie of self-reliance, the belief that you should be able to handle life on your own. And today, we're taking the next step, because self-reliance doesn't stay neutral. It leads somewhere. It leads to isolation. Isolation carries a cost that most people don't fully understand until they've been living in it for a while. So today we're going to talk about what isolation actually does to us, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, and why stepping out of it is one of the most important moves that you can make towards freedom. So take a breath, pull up a chair, and let's get real. This is Unmasked. You see, isolation, it doesn't normally start loud. In fact, it rarely begins with a big decision. You don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to disconnect from everyone. It starts small. You stop sharing something that's bothering you. You keep a conversation surface level instead of going deeper. You tell yourself, I'll deal with it later. And in the moment, those choices don't feel significant. In fact, they may feel practical. They may feel like that you're just managing your life. But over time, those small decisions compound. You start opening up less. You start trusting less. You start letting fewer people into what's really going on. Before long, you're living a life where most people know you, but very few people actually know what's happening inside of you. And that is isolation. Not necessarily being alone, but being unknown. See, there's a difference between solitude and isolation. So let's be clear about something here. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Solitude is healthy. Solitude is intentional. It's a time alone with God, time to think, time to rest, time to reset. Jesus practiced solitude. He could step away from crowds, from ministry, from pressure, and spend time alone in prayer. Solitude strengthens you. Isolation, however, it does the opposite. It weakens you. Because isolation is not chosen for growth. It's chosen for protection. Isolation says that I would rather deal with this alone than risk letting someone in. And the problem with that mindset is that it slowly disconnects you from the truth. Because when you're isolated, your perspective becomes limited to your own thoughts. And your thoughts are not always the most reliable. In fact, one of the most dangerous effects of isolation is how it changes the way that you think. See, when you're isolated, your struggles feel a lot bigger. Your fears feel more convincing. Your assumptions go unchallenged. Your narrative in your head, it starts to take over. You begin to believe things like, no one would understand. This isn't that big of a deal. I should be able to handle this. I'll deal with it eventually. And because there's no one speaking into your life consistently, those thoughts go unchecked. Isolation removes perspective. And without perspective, small issues grow into big problems. Things that could have been addressed early become patterns. Patterns become habits. Habits become strongholds. And all of it is happening quietly in the background. No announcement, no warning, just a slow drift. See, isolation doesn't just affect your thinking. It also affects your emotional health. Because when you carry everything alone, there's no release. There's no place to process. There's no place to be fully honest. And so the weight builds. Stress builds. Frustration builds. And eventually, it shows up. Sometimes it shows up as irritability. You find yourself snapping at people over small things. Have you ever done that? I know I have. Sometimes it shows up as numbness. You stop feeling the way that you used to. Sometimes it shows up as anxiety. Your mind won't slow down and you can't turn things off. And sometimes it shows up as exhaustion. Not because you're doing too much physically, but because you're carrying too much emotionally. And the hard part is when you're isolated, you don't always recognize what's causing it. You just know that something feels off. But there's another area of cost that isolation brings. It also costs and affects your spiritual life. Because when you disconnect from people, you often begin to disconnect from God as well in subtle ways. Not necessarily completely, but gradually. Your prayers become less honest. You stop bringing the full weight of what you're dealing with. You keep things surface level. And over time, your relationship with God starts to feel distant. Not because he moved, but because isolation has trained you to hold on to things, to hold them in. And holding things in is the opposite of surrender. 1 Peter 5:8 says to be alert because the enemy prowls like a roaring lion. And here's what predators do. They isolate. They look for the one that's separated from the group. Because isolation makes you vulnerable. When you're isolated, you're easier to deceive. You're easier to discourage. You're easier to overwhelm. And that's why isolation is so dangerous. It doesn't just affect your circumstances. It affects your ability to see clearly. So if isolation is so harmful, why do we stay there? Well, we stay there because it feels safe. It feels controlled. It feels predictable. In isolation, you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to risk being misunderstood. You don't have to deal with uncomfortable conversations. You don't have to let anyone see your struggles. And in the short term, that's easier. But with what feels easy now often costs you later. Because the longer you stay isolated, the harder it becomes to step out. The walls get thicker. The habits get stronger. The fears get louder. And eventually the isolation, it starts to feel normal. At some point, though, we all hit a turning point. We hit a moment where isolation stops working for us. It might come through a conversation or through burnout. It might come through a realization that you're tired of carrying everything alone. But something shifts and you begin to see things differently. You realize that what felt like protection has actually been holding you back. That moment is important because it creates an opportunity to step out, not dramatically, not all at once, but intentionally. Breaking out of isolation does not require a huge move. In fact, it starts small. It starts with honesty. It might look like telling somebody that I've been struggling. It might look like answering honestly when someone says, "How are you doing?" It might look like joining a group, even when it feels uncomfortable. The goal isn't to tell everyone everything. It's to stop carrying everything alone. Because the moment that you bring something into the light, it loses power. James 5:16 says to confess your struggles to one another and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Healing does not happen in isolation. It happens in connection. So let me ask you something. Where have you been isolating? Where have you been carrying on your own? What have you been carrying on your own? What conversations have you been avoiding? And what would it look like to take that one step out of isolation this week? Not a big step, just one. Because freedom doesn't begin with a crowd. It begins with connection. Next time on Unmasked, we're going to talk about the power of brotherhood. Because stepping out of isolation is one thing. Building the right relationships is another. We're going to talk about what real community actually looks like. And why the right people in your life can change everything. If this episode resonated with you, would you take a moment and share it with somebody that came to mind while you were listening? And remember this, isolation may feel safe, but it will never lead to freedom. Freedom is found in connection, and it begins the moment that you stop walking alone and you choose to live unmasked. God bless you.